Well, the Exodus. You know, it occurred to me this week that a few folks may have passed up this topic because it seems so remote. I mean, why do we come to church? Well, yeah, the Exodus is in the Bible, and it's an interesting story, but we know the story, and even though I've titled it, Talk the Way I Did, maybe it's hard to really see it as relevant to modern-day Christians. So I think there are two reasons why everybody should be here, and I'm grateful that you are. I mentioned one last week, and I'll give you the other one in a minute. The first one is that the Exodus is not just a story, it's the story. It's the birthing narrative of both Judaism and Christianity. So it's very relevant. For most scholars, it's where it begins. The other reason is, we don't talk about this, but we're going to talk about it a little bit in this class. It's the beginning of what ultimately will be monotheism. It's that first step. If you want to, you can make this argument that historically it's the first step toward monotheism. And we know how monotheism ultimately is going to change all of Western history. In fact, all of human history. We're not, the Western world is not exclusively monotheistic, but certainly for our heritage, it changed everything. We're not there yet at the Exodus, but we are there for all people of faith. We're there at the Exodus because we're at the very beginning. And I'm going to give you some more information about that a little later. Where did we leave off last week? Well, we said we were going to look at 4 questions, big questions about the Exodus. Where it happened, when it happened, how many people were on the Exodus, and the last most intriguing question, who were they? Who were the people who actually made the trek across Sinai? Now I told you that I'm going primarily, not exclusively, but primarily on a new book, relatively new book, only a couple of years old, The Exodus, by Professor Richard Friedman at the University of Georgia. His specialty is Jewish studies. And he has come up with his understanding of the Exodus. It's not exclusively his. There are other scholars that I've been reading that would share this view, or at least some part of his view. You can see these scholars sort of coming together with this whole understanding of the Exodus. But I'm going to give you today and next week where he's going with his argument. I'm laying the groundwork for you, so next week will make sense. Okay. Last week we left off. We got to the dating issue. When did it happen? Now that might seem maybe a little too intellectual, a little too academic. Do you really care? Yesterday morning, by chance, 2 of Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on our door. And, well, no, these are great folks. We've seen them before. We know them pretty well. And I got into quite a discussion about it.
For coffee?
Well, they were surprisingly open to the possibility that it's okay to question the Bible. You don't have to be literalist, and they agreed, you don't have to be a literalist to still be a person of faith. Now, yeah, there's going to be a big area in there where we will not agree on every detail. Anyway, so I asked them, does your church have an official position on when the Exodus occurred? And they didn't know, of course, and so I gave them that assignment.
And they will never be back.
Actually, how all that got started was, Professor Friedman says that the word Jehovah is actually a mispronunciation because when the Germans translated Yahweh into their language, they switched the Y for a J, which is customary in the spelling. And so somebody saw Yahweh as spelled with a J, and that guy and pronounced it in a way that sounded like Jehovah, and that's how ultimately the word Jehovah comes into the lexicon, and da-da-da-da-da-da, you can fill in all the blanks. And I asked them if they knew that, and they said no.
Right.
They were very intrigued that I had actually explained, or at least the professor had explained about that. Anyway, so where we left it, last week, you remember, I went into a lot of detail to try to explain how the Bible dates the Exodus. What the answer was the 1400s BC, the mid-1400s BC. That's the biblical view. And I explained to you some of the problems that creates for scholars. It's not a slam dunk by any means. Always trying to be respectful of the Bible, of course. Scholars are not trying to trash the Bible. That's absurd. But they are interested, is it possible to reconcile what we know historically with what the Bible says happened? That's the big difficulty. Today I'm going to give you theory number 2 as to when the Exodus occurred. This is what we call the historical explanation as opposed to the biblical explanation. Just to give you, because you've got to know what this other theory is. We have a reference here in Exodus chapter 1, right up front. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, you know the story. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. Now, we have here something very specific. Scholars, of course, get excited when there's something specific that seems to be historical, because that gives you a clue. It gives you something to actually get your teeth into, to work with as an historian, as a scholar, as an archaeologist, as a linguist, whatever your specialty might be. It gives you something. You got to start somewhere. Here we have 2 very important elements. We have 2 names, Pithom and Ramesses, and they are called store cities. A store city is where the Pharaoh warehoused commodities as a protection against a catastrophe, such as a flood or a famine, etc. So he was foresighted enough to prepare for that. So he had his slaves building these facilities and then filling them with whatever was appropriate. That part makes perfectly good sense historically. We don't have to, this is not controversial that the Pharaoh would do this. The beauty, of course, here is that we don't just have a confirmation that he built store cities, but we've got 2 names. One of the names, Ramesses, is the big clue. Because if you look at all the pharaohs that we know about, dozens and dozens of pharaohs, there's only a few that had that name. So you can focus right quickly on what's called the 19th dynasty, because that's the only place you find pharaohs named Ramesses. You've got 1, 2, 3, and there might have been a 4th, I can't remember. In any case, we know a lot about these people because Ramesses I didn't live very long. He was only on the throne a short time, but his grandson, Ramesses II, is one of the most famous and important pharaohs ever. So we know lots about him. He was, I'm going to call him larger than life. He did everything to excess. He built more projects, he married more wives, he put up more statues to himself, you name it. If it can be over the top, this guy knows how to do it. He's a narcissistic to the... Anyway, but that's good news, you see, for us, because the scholars can get their teeth into this. They can tell us a lot about him. As I point out here, he actually reigned for 66 years. That's a lot of historical record to work with. The Egyptians love to create records boasting about themselves, which again is good news. If you have to have information, better to have exaggerated information than no information, right? Okay, so we have logically here a figure who fits very nicely with the biblical account of the Exodus. A big builder, no question he would have enslaved people and used them to build store cities. So we have nice consistency here, plus the consistency with this name, Ramesses. We don't have to fish around. Remember last week we were fishing around. Was it Amenhotep? Was it Tutmos? Who might the Pharaoh have been? Today we don't have to worry about that. We have another reason why scholars are excited about this man as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. This is a very obscure clue that you probably don't know about. The son of Ramesses II was a man named, I have it here, Meneptah, who built himself a monument, like all the other pharaohs, built a monument to boast about his military victories. I even got a picture of it for you. The Meneptah Stele. The monument, wow. Scholars call this kind of a monument a stele, okay? This one happens to be about 10 feet tall, just so you can know what you're looking at here. About 10 feet tall, 5 feet wide, roughly. When this was discovered, it was a sensation. Because when the Pharaoh lists all of his conquests, he's naming the people he conquered. So it becomes an historical list, you see, that you can try to reconcile with what else we know about the history of the Middle East. Most of the invasions are going to be to the north, into Asia, into the what today is Israel and Jordan, Syria, Iraq, etc. Because that was the worrisome spot for Egypt. So they would push that way. The Meneptah Stele mentions all of these people, and if you look closely, the scholars discovered he talks about getting rid of Israel. He says, I annihilated them. To the last one, killed them all. The people of Israel. We have to be careful here. This is not a geographical reference. This is a cultural reference. The people of, the people who are called themselves the people who identified as Israel. It's the nation, in a non-geographical sense, of Israel. This is the first, earliest reference we ever have found to somebody known as Israel. This is huge for archaeologists and other biblical scholars. And the beauty, the additional beauty is we can date the Meneptah Stele within maybe 5 years. Now I've given you the date here of 1210 to 1205, it might be 1208, it might be, we don't care. We are so close now as to when this was erected, we have a bracket. We've got a people settled in Canaan with this identity by the end of the 1200s. So scholars say you've got the people settled in Canaan, and for 66 years ahead of that, or back, I should say backward, you've got a Pharaoh who fits perfectly with the biblical account. So these are the two strong arguments that scholars, most scholars, many scholars, like Ramesses II as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Why don't they like the biblical account plus the Meneptah Stele? The answer is it's too much time if you push the Exodus back 2 more centuries to the 1400s as opposed to the middle of the 1200s. There's too much time in there, scholars argue, for the nation of Israel to have been in place, and there's no reference to it. Meneptah Stele is the first reference. So you've got to, for the scholarly point of view, you've got to bring the Exodus forward and get it much closer to the Meneptah Stele for it to make sense. Okay? Now we can argue about that. Some scholars will.
When was the stele discovered?
When was it discovered? 1900s. I think, either late 1800s or 1900s. I can look that up for you. And it's on display, obviously. It's been preserved.
Stuart.
Yeah.
Many years ago, when I was getting my master's degree, I had to take archaeology. And at that time, one of the prevailing theories about the Exodus was that sometime in the 1400s, the volcano Thera on the island of Santorini erupted. And they know that at a specific time. And that it, in turn, caused the tsunami that wiped out the surrounding area, but that it was responsible for the parting of the Reed Sea. And I just wondered if have you run across that theory? Is it totally obliterated now, or?
Does everybody hear that?
No.
Okay. There has been, as you know, there's always somebody trying to come up with a natural explanation for a biblical event, for what seems to be a miraculous event. Perfectly reasonable that we would try to come up, you know, as educated folks, that we would say, well, maybe there is actually a natural explanation as opposed to a miraculous. Or maybe somehow you can put the two together. In any case, God could use a natural event to perform a miraculous act. You could put the two together. These folks who've looked at what was going on in the world at the presumed time of the Exodus have come up with this volcanic eruption from an island out in the Mediterranean that seems to have caused all kinds of effects that could in turn explain the miracles of the Exodus. I'm going to cut to the chase and tell you, the scholars say forget it.
Oh, really?
There is a very learned paper, I didn't bring the book today, but I told you that in 2013 there was a conference held in San Diego to bring in all possible world scholars on the Exodus. And those papers are published. I brought them last week, I didn't bring them today. But there is part of the one paper deals entirely with this theory. Can the volcano explain the biblical account of the Exodus? You know, we don't need to go there, which is actually good news, because it's very complicated to try to get every effect of the Exodus somehow connected back to the volcano. Okay. Now there was a documentary, in fact, on TV. The gentleman who did that is quite aggressive about pursuing these very unusual theories. And of course, it's pretty impressive. You watch these saying, oh wow, you know, but scholars know. Okay, the next big question I want to move on to is this issue of how many people were on the Exodus. I'm going to make a big deal out of this because Professor Friedman makes a big deal out of it. Yeah.
Before you leave the date question,
Okay.
you said mid-12th century.
Mid-1200s would fit with Ramesses.
But that's about the same time that you had them attacking Israel. So, I mean, it could have happened 20 years before, 20 years after. Both of these events happened in the same century is what I heard.
If the two events we're talking about are the Exodus and the establishment of the Hebrews in Canaan.
No, the attack. Ramses II's son attacking you had that in the 1200s.
Oh, that would
too.
have to be in the 1200s, because he's already, yes, he puts up the stele by the end of that century to say, look what I did, yes.
So,
You'd have three things: the Exodus, his attack on the people. You'd have the Exodus, the establishment of Israel as a people, and then the military attack against them.
and do you determine which came first, the attack or the Exodus? Or?
Well, the Exodus, if we go by the biblical account, now he's going to come up with a different idea. But if we go by the biblical chronology, the Exodus came first. Then Israel, then the military attack. The military attack is actually fairly irrelevant for our purposes. It just gives us the stele.
Thanks.
Okay, how many people were on the Exodus? Boy, this is, you're going to have fun with this. We have two accounts. From Exodus 12, the Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth. They were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children, and many other people went up with them, also large droves of livestock, flocks, and herds. This clearly is a big operation. Now, the same thing is described in Numbers, the book of Numbers. Now remember, everything about the Exodus takes us to Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. That's where all of this is focused, on the Torah. How reliable is the Torah historically? Okay? These are the Israelites counted according to their families. All the men in the camps by their divisions, number 603,550. Wow, we've got an exact number now. The first account says about 600,000. Okay, that's fine. But here now we have the actual counting. And if you go back to this part of Numbers, I left all this out, but you'll see how meticulous they're crunching the numbers, tribe by tribe by tribe, okay? The Levites are not being counted because Moses was told to leave them out. They are special. They have special responsibilities. And he's going to talk a lot about this, okay, later. So all of these pieces are going to come together. I hope I'll try to bring them together for you. We have 2 clues here that are extremely important. In the first passage, we have the phrase, men on foot. In the second passage, we have the phrase, men in the camps. Now, scholars say that those 2 phrases suggest what you and I would call men of military age. Young men, strong men, presumably the best slaves in Egypt, among the best slaves, and they're being counted in the neighborhood of 600,000 on the Exodus. That leaves a lot of other people. If we're just looking at 600,000 young males, that leaves a whole bunch of other people consistent with the biblical story that must have been on the Exodus. This is where scholars try to play, again, a numbers crunching game. Can you go back and extrapolate from that one number, 600,000, and come up with a total of everybody on the Exodus? Can you make some kind of reasonable assumptions about who else was there, put numbers to each of those categories, and come up with a grand total? Can you do that? Well, I tried. Rather than pick a scholar who did this, I said, I'm going to try the same methodology just for our purposes here today. It doesn't really matter if I'm right or wrong. It's the methodology. Am I following the correct methodology? Okay? How many is too many? Okay, where do I start? Well, I have to start with 600,000, the men on foot, okay? I said, how many of these men would be married? If they were strong, they were useful for slave work, for construction of cities, bringing in the produce, whatever it was. You'd have to know a lot about Egyptian marital customs among the Hebrews, etc. Remember, all the Hebrews are raised Egyptian. They're living in a pagan world. I told you last time we talked about this, not last week, but years ago, I told you that Moses was not a Jew. Remember? Well, remember, they're Egyptian. I arbitrarily said a third of the 600,000 were married. Okay? That means 200,000 of them were married. Okay. I said a lot of these young men must have had parents who came on the trip with them. But not all. Obviously, some parents would have passed away. Some would be sick. Some would be handicapped, injured, whatever. So you have to eliminate a lot of the potential parents there. So I narrowed it down to 2/3. I said of the men on foot, 2/3 had their mother and father with them. That's where I come up with this 400,000 mothers, 400,000 fathers. That gives us 800,000 parents of the men on foot. Okay? Then I took the wives of those men, that's the 200,000. Then I said, okay, let's now lump all the other males in one category. How do you do that? How do you come up with a number? I just arbitrarily picked 200,000. It seemed, uncles, grandfathers, cousins, other males not related to the men on foot, other slaves, whatever. Of those other men, I said half were married. Again, I'm just throwing darts at the board here, you know. So I have to put in the wives. There's your 100,000 wives of the other men. There were other women, grandmothers, aunts, cousins, whatever. And I did the same thing, made the same assumption, 100,000 other women. Now that includes, well, let's see, actually, you could argue that I've got this wrong, because the other women would include the wives of the other men. Anyway, then you got to put in the children. The Bible says children were there. So I made a very conservative guess at 2 children per marriage. And that's where I come up with the 600,000.
That would be conservative, I think.
I think it would be very
At that time,
Right, exactly.
they were probably huge families.
But look at my total. 2.6 million people. Wow, on the Exodus. I'm gonna cut to the chase and tell you, no scholar would agree with me. Most scholars would say that I have way overestimated. Now this is really bizarre, because I think you're right, I've underestimated the children. But most scholars would say I've overestimated the total. So somewhere I'm very wrong in here. In any case, the number that most scholars like conservatively is 2 million. A few will say 2.5 million on the Exodus. That's the best range that you'll find. 2 million is the preferred number, and that's certainly where Professor Friedman is. He thinks if you argue biblically, you've got 2 million people on the Exodus. Now I thought about this, and I've mentioned this before. 2 million people, that's a lot of people. Can we relate that to the modern world, to our world? Is there any place you can get a lot of people together to try to grasp what it takes to organize a lot of people? So I did a quick survey on the internet looking for sports arenas, sports venues. I said that brings people together. Military activity obviously brings people together, but that's a whole different situation with other issues that are not in play here. So I found a lot of sports venues, but to my surprise, the biggest I could find, maybe you know, maybe you can guess, Indianapolis. Now I found conflicting estimates of how many seats there are, but I'm close here with 257,325 seating capacity. Okay? 257, let's just say 250,000 people can get into the Speedway. I think this picture tells us the problem we've got with the Exodus story. If you wanted to accommodate all the people on the Exodus at 2 million, you would have to build 7 more motor speedways. It would take 8 Indianapolis motor speedways to accommodate 2 million people packed in like this. And this obviously is totally impossible if we're going to talk about moving these people. We can get them in, we can get them out.
Maybe take a couple steps back in your presentation. You make the case that the number is important. Why is it important?
Thank you, good question. The professor is going to say that the number is important because the traditional understanding of the Exodus story is that we have the precedent of Abraham moving his family from the Fertile Crescent all the way down the eastern shore of the Mediterranean through Canaan, and ultimately his descendants, his children, grandchildren, are going to end up in Egypt. And Egypt will become the cradle of what will become the Jewish people. The Exodus being the key link between the Hebrews in Egypt and the settlement in Canaan, the Promised Land. So the big issue is the Exodus. To get the Jews in the Promised Land, you've got to have an Exodus because they were all in Egypt. He's gonna take a contrarian view and say that never happened. He's not gonna say the Exodus didn't happen, but he's gonna say you cannot explain the settlement of Israel, the people of Israel in Canaan, with the Exodus. And the number is the problem,
Yeah.
okay?
There are those who would say that the whole Moses story, the whole Exodus, is a complete myth. What do you,
That's absolutely correct.
huh?
That's absolutely correct. There are people who say that. Those are the people that we put at the far end of the spectrum of opinion, the so-called maximalists. I told you last week, we have the people who say the Bible is 100% correct, cannot be wrong, must be taken literally. If there were 600,000 men on foot, there were 600,000 men on foot. That's the maximalist position. The minimalist is the opposite, saying none of it happened. Most scholars are in the middle, including Professor Friedman, who says, yes, there was an Exodus, but he's gonna redefine it the way he thinks it really happened. And that's what I'm building up to here.
Another parameter would be the total population of Egypt at the time this group carved out of there. And I don't know where the population of Egypt is now, maybe 100 million or something like that, but I can remember back in the 50s, it was probably 40 or 50 million, 1950s. And so what would the total population of Egypt been at that time that you could carve out 2 million people?
Right. Very, very important question, which the scholars have asked, and I had to research. So, I'm glad you asked, you're way ahead of me. Here we go. First, beautiful, beautiful done, Ian. I had to pick somebody who's researched this very question to share with you where this argument goes. And I came up with a man, Dr. Jensen, who has written a paper on this, and here's where he ended up. He says, we're really in murky territory. The records are not good for looking at populations of Egypt, for a lot of reasons. We don't have to go into all the reasons. But he said, the best we can do is make rough estimates. And he said, this guy says this guy says this guy says this. He distills all that down, and he comes up with this. I told you last week that regardless of whether you go with the biblical dating or with the historical dating, it's the new kingdom of Egypt, what we call the new kingdom, what scholars call the new kingdom. It's either the 18th dynasty or the 19th, but we're in the new kingdom. What was the Egyptian population in the new kingdom? He extrapolates. He says if we take a conservative number for the slaves at 200,000, that's going to be somewhere between 8 and 10% of the total population of Egypt at this time. If we've got 200,000 slaves, and that's 10% of the population, we have a total population of 2 million. So you can see here now we have a huge dilemma. We can't have 2 million people on the Exodus and 2 million people living in Egypt totally. Because that means you had to evacuate. Number one, that means everybody in Egypt was a slave. And then number two, you evacuated everyone.
The first part may have been true.
Stuart, what about, there was a PBS program on this, which might not have been true, that said the whole number was a lot less. I mean, even the 600,000 was too many.
Professor Friedman's gonna say 600,000 is way too many.
All right, well, that's what this PBS shows it.
Right. And that is certainly where a lot of scholars are moving now. He's not alone. But he's laid out what's a very interesting hypothesis to support this. Another reason to question the 2 million here, you'll remember this part of the story. Moses and his brother Aaron go to Pharaoh to say, we need a 3-day hiatus, we need a 3-day rest in order to take the slaves into the desert, which is Sinai, into the wilderness, to give praise to our God, to make sacrifices to our God. Now, it's hard to imagine anybody asking the Pharaoh to allow any of his slaves to rest. How many slaves are we talking about? you know, 50, 100, 500, 2,000, whatever, this is cheap labor. And you know the answer. He not only told them to drop dead, he added to their burdens to teach them a lesson. Not even 3 days. Well, obviously, Moses is not going to ask to remove 2 million people, even for 3 days, from the Pharaoh's labor force. So we're in an absurd kind of frame of reference here. Yes, sir.
If I'm following what you're saying, you feel that we can comfortably date the timing of the Exodus to roughly during Ramsey II's reign. Do I have that part right?
I'm going to qualify that to say, because I have to be fair here to everybody, that right now would be what we could call a consensus opinion. I've got papers that say that's wrong.
All right, and if we take that point and we then say, and the slaves were used to create storehouses and other things, those are objects that can be dated. Can someone look at all the objects that existed at or around 1200 BC and say, it's not possible that it would require this many people to have created these different buildings, artifacts, whatever?
I'm going to say that's about 50% right. The 50% is yes, archaeologists have made enormous effort to come up with what they call material culture, something physical which points us one way or another on any of these issues, dating being a biggie. That's the good news. The bad news is they found nothing. We just have to wipe material culture off the map in terms of trying to satisfy ourselves on some of these problems. There's nothing in Egyptian records or that have survived, nothing like the Merneptah stealing, you know. Okay, now 2 more quickies and we'll keep going here. In the Bible, you know, the Pharaoh starts to worry about the birth rate among the Hebrews, and so his solutions, such as it was, is to kill the males, babies. So he can't do it. He can't send his army in there. He's already got midwives in position to work with the Hebrews, so he tells them to kill the babies, the newborn males. The Bible actually gives us a new piece of information, which is the names of the midwives. That's the good news. The bad news is there are only 2. Obviously, you can't have a population of 2 million slaves that 2 midwives can possibly help. We have to be talking about drastically smaller numbers. And by the way, apropos what the question in the back, we only have 2 store cities. It's not, you wouldn't conceivably need 2 million people to build 2 store cities. I didn't mention that here. Now, here is an exercise. You may not believe anybody did this, but I'm going to show you how they did it. He mentions that some scholars said, okay, let's try to respect the biblical text. If in fact there were 2 million people on the Exodus, how were they organized to make their march? We have to assume that the pathway through Sinai was primitive, which it was, even today, as you probably know. It couldn't have been much of a path. So we can't have people spread out all over the place. For the purpose of this exercise, we're going to say you could have a row of people, 8 persons wide. You might get 8 people in the row, and then there'd be another row of 8 and another row of 8. If you did it that way, if you could organize it that way, how long would the line be? And the answer turned out to be that when Moses, at the head, got halfway through Sinai to Mount Sinai, the end of the line would still be in Egypt. Now, on his face, that sounds ridiculous. It sounds like somebody's trying to be a smart aleck. Come on. Well, let's try it. I tried it. Let's go with what the professor says. A row of 8, followed by a row of 8, followed by a row of 8. What the professor didn't tell me was how far apart those rows were. So I had to make an assumption, and I made a very conservative assumption. I packed people in with only 5 feet between a row. Okay? We can argue about this, because there's a lot of other factors I'm not mentioning. 8 people per row, okay, 5 feet apart. How many rows can you get in a mile? Well, you can see the math for yourself. A little over 1,000. 1,000 rows in 1 mile, that's quite a little. And well, okay, how many people is that? Well, 8 times 1,056, we've got over 8,000 people in 1 mile. We have packed them in. We're trying to be very fair to the text here. Well, if that's true, if you've got that many people in a mile, how many miles does it take to accommodate 2 million people? The answer I came up with is 237 miles. Close, hang on. Well, is that reasonable? How far is it from Egypt to Mount Sinai? I had to make an assumption where the route was, because nobody actually knows. Let's see if I can do this. Here's the tradition, it's here too, by the way. The traditional route, you can see, if I don't know if you can see my pointer. Here's the land of the 2 store cities right here. And the red line is the route they probably took, if you go with the Bible, coming down the western coast of Sinai, all the way down. It's the longest way to go, by the way, down to Mount Sinai, which is, sorry. Here we go. Here's Mount Sinai way down here. Well, I made a rough estimate on my map from Sinai to Egypt, depending on how you define the boundaries of Egypt. So we can go back. Oh, still going wrong here, sorry. It's about 250 miles. So the 237 is very consistent with 250, because you already recognize, without me even telling you, you can't pack people in 5 feet apart as they're walking. Some go slow, some go fast, some are carrying a child, some are carrying possession. You've got almost something approaching chaos when you're dealing with these quantities. So 237 miles is very reasonable. The scholar was right. If Moses was at Sinai, his last line is still in Egypt. Does that make any sense? Well, I'll just throw that out. These are the kind of questions scholars are asking.
So I looked up the distance from Cairo to Jerusalem. It's 740 kilometers, which I think is around 300 miles from Cairo to Jerusalem. But the modern road does run due east and then turn due north. It doesn't go along the coastline, which would be technically shorter and not the path they follow.
Right.
If it's 300 miles from Cairo to Jerusalem, one would wonder why 40 years, and it implies to me that they weren't lost. They were doing something else other than being lost in the wilderness.
Okay. There are really 2 questions there, both of them good questions.
But it may not be the right time for them.
Well, I'll give you the quick answer. Let's see. Scholars have debated about which route they used. There were 4 possible routes across Sinai. And you got to remember, we never talk about this. This was not Moses was not unfamiliar with Sinai, because when he fled Egypt, remember, where did he go? He went to Midian, and you can see on the map where Midian is. He had to cross the Sinai Peninsula to get to Midian. And then to get back to Egypt to lead the Exodus, he had to come back across Midian, back across Sinai. So the Exodus was Moses' third time crossing Sinai. He kind of knew a way to do it. Why did they take the longest way, which is the way scholars think they went, this longest way all the way down and then back up? The answer that I got from a Jewish scholar was the water supply. But there's another reason too. The route that that's talking about, which is right along the Mediterranean coast, was the main highway between Canaan and Egypt. Egypt heavily guarded it. There were military posts all along. They knew who was coming into their land. Nobody wanted to go through Sinai. So Egypt knew where to put its resources. That's the last place the slaves wanted to be. So that's the reason they didn't take the coastal route, which you're absolutely right, was the obvious way to go. If they were friendly, you know. Okay. So this is a reasonable assumption which seems to dispute the 2 million number. Okay. Now, here's where Professor Friedman is going with this. The tradition, and it's a very strong tradition, is that Moses wrote the Torah. Who better than Moses? He was the key figure in the whole process. He met with God on the mountain. He received God's commandments and God's instructions. He led his people through the worst of the worst. Well, we got a lot of problems with this tradition, as strong as it is, centuries and centuries, and even today. First of all of the Torah is anonymous. There is no author named. Number two, Moses, throughout the Torah, is referred to in the third person. Now you could say, well, Moses was just being modest. Well, read it for yourself. I mean, you can do what the scholars do. Read it and see if you get that impression that this is really Moses being humble. Number three, in Genesis 36, there's a list of the kings of Edom. See if I can. You see where Edom is? One of the nations near, one of the countries near the Sinai. There's a list of the kings that the Hebrews had to deal with over the years. The problem is that all the kings identified in the Torah lived long after Moses was dead. He could not possibly have known who these people were going to be centuries later. Okay? Then we have this phrase in there, which is common, to this day. Scholars pick up on this and say, well, that doesn't sound like an eyewitness talking. That sounds like an historian talking, somebody looking back at something that happened a long time ago. Today, you wouldn't say, well, to this day, I went to McDonald's. McDonald's is still there to this day. That's where I ate yesterday. I mean, you wouldn't phrase it that way. So that's, are we picking here? You can say, well, the scholars are being a little picky. Anyway, I throw that in because I'm just giving you some of their reasoning. The Torah is very flattering to Moses for obvious reasons. He was the great figure of the Torah. But again, that doesn't sound like him talking about himself. And lastly is the most troublesome problem of all, which is Moses' obituaries in Deuteronomy. Now, there are other reasons why scholars reject Moses as the author. I'm not going to keep going with this. This list gives you a nice taste of that.
Stuart, we have about 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay. If Moses didn't write it, who did? And we're back to the book. I'm going to wait till next week to explain this to you because this is very complicated. who actually wrote the Torah. There's multiple authors. Right now, the favorite theory, and it's a theory, the favorite theory is there's multiple authors whose names we don't know, but we sure can figure out who wrote what. Isn't that intriguing? There are enough clues in the Torah that we now feel, most scholars, not all scholars, most scholars would say we have a pretty good idea of why this passage is different from this passage in certain respects. And I'm going to explain that to you, and I'm going to let you use your Bible so you can see exactly what the scholars did. You don't have to just hear me tell you. You can try it yourself. We'll walk through a little exercise, and you can see if that makes sense to you. So I will leave it there for now, and let's see, are there any more questions?
I said something about the PBS series. There's several PBS series or programs on biblical history. What is
There are.
your opinion of them?
Well, I don't watch them all.
All right.
Here's the problem. The best ones will give you a talking head, several talking heads, of people who are clearly recognized as scholars. I will recognize some of them myself. I've read their books, I've heard their lectures, and so forth. So I am comfortable that whoever did the program went to these people first. I remember a very interesting story one scholar told about himself, a guy named Bart Ehrman, who teaches University of North Carolina. He's a contrarian. He's more controversial than a lot of the scholars because he's more skeptical of a lot of things. But he teaches a lot of courses on Christianity. So you gotta be careful before you say to him, you don't know what you're talking about. In any case, he told the story that years ago, and you'll remember this, I think, a stone box was found in Egypt, not by archaeologists, unfortunately, but by a dealer in antiquities, which always raises the question of, is it real or is it fake? The box is what was called an ossuary, which is a burial box. It's the way the Jews buried certain people. On the side of it, it said, let's see, the ossuary of, it said, this is James, the brother of Jesus. Remember this? Well, of course, that's in every newspaper. The brother of Jesus' tomb, his coffin, stone, has been found with his name on it. Well, the National Geographic, I think they must have been involved in analyzing this or in publicizing this. It turned out they called Bart Ehrman at the University of North Carolina to get a talking head, to get somebody to authenticate this. And Bart said this was an unreal conversation. The person he spoke to, I don't know who it was clueless about biblical history, Christian history, knew nothing. He could have told her anything, and she wouldn't know whether he's right or wrong. Well, okay, fine. To her credit, she's calling an expert. Got to give him that. But it meant that he had to start from scratch before he could comment on the ossuary itself. So there is this issue of how much homework did a television producer actually do? Where did he get his talking heads? Why did he pick this guy and not this guy, or whatever? So,
That was a forgery, right?
Yeah.
It was deemed a forgery.
it was, yeah, this is very interesting. What happened was the Israeli Antiquities Authority, the Jewish Antiquities Authority, I think that's the correct name. See, the Jewish Antiquities or Israeli? Israel. The Israel Antiquities Authority sued the dealer on the grounds that it was a forgery. They lost. They lost the case. So we don't know.
But statistically, a high percentage of the population was named James.
Yes, very common name, and that's what Jesus. Because remember last week I told you that Jesus, his real name was Joshua. So Joshua is very common name.
18%.
Okay, next week, stay tuned.